Well, hello out there. Greetings to all you digging deeper enthusiasts. Thanks for tuning in to our final digging deeper of the season. The friends of the Sawtooth Avalanche Center put this on, or spend a fair amount of resources to help put this on. And Amy couldn't make it today, so you're stuck with me as your MC, your host with the not quite most. But I'll do what I can here. So I guess one special thanks to everyone who stuck with us this long in the year through all the trials and tribulations while we were figuring out Zoom, and still are evidently. It's having some glitches there at the intro. I don't know if any of you saw that, but it's been a learning experience. But we have some pretty cool technology now that we'll probably hopefully do a combo of live and virtual events going forward, because we can't wait to get back to some of our big supporters venues. And one of those, we have one of the nicest couples. I'm looking at them right there, Brent and Sue from Ski Tech. So they've been longtime Avalanche Center supporters, some of the nicest people around, and doing an amazing job keeping everyone's feet nice and happy. I'll say that. So Brent and Sue, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, hey, Brent and Sue here. And we're really glad to do this. It's so funny, I started skiing in Central Idaho in the prehistoric times, and I really should be dead. All the close calls and crazy things and so little knowledge. And it's so great now to have the center, it's an amazing learning thing for me all the time. And it's just getting better and better. So we've got to all support this. It's just a great thing. My wife and I look at the weather report even all the time, so it's cool. We're open, for boots and skis and mounting and skin cutting and liners and footbeds year round. So don't be afraid to call us. We'd love to do it. And gosh, stay safe. It's been a crazy year. A lot of close calls in every way in life.
Let's hope for some spring skiing.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Brent. So yeah, it's not done yet, like Brent said. So we'll hear more about that tonight from Chris, but definitely stop into your favorite shop. Ski Tech is they're there. They're ready to help you out with your any needs that you have. Awesome. Well, we'll move on to tonight's show, a couple housekeeping items. So if you have a question, and we want to encourage live questions, that's that raise hand feature. It makes it way more fun, way more interesting when we get to hear your voices out there and see who's out there and get to talk to you a little bit. And that way you can ask follow-ups too if you don't get your question answered exactly how you want it. So and I think especially with this one being the last one and the topic, which we'll get to in a second, it's quite fitting to be able to ask some live questions towards the end. If you have a question you don't want to ask live, or you want to get it in the middle, because we probably won't stop things in the middle to ask live questions until Chris is towards the end of the presentation. But if you have a question and put it up there, you can hit the Q&A button and type it in there, and I'll be monitoring things. And if it's something that really fits in with something that he's talking about right then, I'll stop and interrupt him and say, hey, we have a great question about this. Or I may push it to the end if it seems like it's something that he's going to cover a little bit later. But I will find a spot. So keep them coming. Life's not a spectator sport. You get what you put into it. So ask questions and take advantage of the chance to talk to Chris here. So yeah, we'll move right into the talk. So Chris Lundy, who doesn't really need an introduction, he's been working in various aspects in the Avalanche world here since 2004, I believe. Is that right, Chris? In the area? So he was at the center from 2004 through 2011, took a hiatus to be a guide and teach Avalanche classes. And then fortunately for us at the Avalanche Center, and probably many of you too, who didn't hire him to be a guide or teach a class, you get more bang for your buck for sure from Chris giving forecasts and doing these talks. So Chris is going to talk to us about spring conditions, kind of conditions update, and then what to do when there is no avalanche forecast. So with that, take it away, Chris. I'm going to hide myself, but I'll be here.
All right, Scotty, you see my screen there?
I do.
Great, thanks. All right, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for attending our last Digging Deeper of the winter. It's been quite a ride this year doing all these via Zoom. After doing a number of these, I'm still proud to say I'm not used to talking to my computer screen. I think that's a good thing. But as Scotty mentioned, please feel free to ask questions during the presentation. I think it really adds to these events when we get a little bit of interaction from the audience. Hope you guys all had a great winter. And if you're here tonight, I'm guessing you're thinking that winter's not over and you're going to ride it out to the bitter end. So congratulations to you for still having some enthusiasm. And we'll see if we can give you guys some information that helps you wrap up your winter and spring season in style. So we're going to talk about what to do once the forecasts have ended, which they have ended last weekend. And we're still putting out what we call general avalanche information. We'll put one out again this Friday and one again early next week and maybe late next week. And then that'll probably be it for our winter. So I'll just help you out as we roll into the spring. But that's not the same as the daily forecast. So we're going to try to give you some information tonight to help you make your kind of your own forecast in the mornings before you head out. So I think Scotty told you how to ask questions. So just another plug, please go ahead and ask questions through the presentation if anything pops up. So here's a little overview of what I'm going to talk about tonight. We're going to start off with just a wet snow avalanche review. Wet snow is one of the primary avalanche concerns through spring, and it's really kind of important for the rest of this presentation to understand a little bit about the wet snow avalanche phenomenon. We'll dive into what's kind of going on right now with the spring conditions, what to look forward to with the weather in the next week or two, and then finally how to come up with your own avalanche forecast during the spring season. So our last Digging Deeper 2 weeks ago was done by a guest speaker, Simon Troutman. He used to be the director of the Avalanche Center here a number of years ago, and he did a presentation specifically on wet snow avalanches. And that presentation is available on YouTube. And if you didn't tune in for that, I encourage you to go back and take a look. It's a really, really good, informative presentation. And as I said, wet snow is what we're typically dealing with through the spring, and understanding it is super helpful. I got a ton out of that presentation, and I think anybody who watches it will too. So the review I'm going to do tonight is going to be really down and dirty. And when it comes to wet snow avalanches, I think there's three really important questions or kind of concepts to understand. So the first question is, how much water is being produced at the surface? How much water is melting at the snowpack surface? And then where is that water going? And then understanding that the wetter the snow is, the weaker it is. So water forms at the surface. Just to back up, wet snow is a really complex phenomenon because all winter we're dealing with basically water in the frozen form, in the form of frozen ice particles or snow. And come spring, we introduce water to the whole equation. So now we're really making things complicated. And when a material is existing right around its freezing point or its triple point, like it does in the spring conditions, it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. So one of the main things to think about with wet snow is the surface water production. So how much melt is going on at the surface? And that melt is driven by primarily sunshine. So the solar input into the snowpack is the primary driver of meltwater at the surface. But certainly we can have rain, especially, it seems like we're getting a few rain events during the winter now. And then as we come into the spring months, the spring storms can often deliver rain even up into the high mountains. And then to a lesser degree, warm temps. So, it's surprising. You can have temperatures that are well above freezing. It might be 40 degrees, even 50 degrees in the air. But on the shady slopes, those high elevation north slopes, that snow is staying dry. So warm temps play a role, but it's not nearly as important as the sun to melting the snow surface. And then how long have those things been happening? How long has the sun been shining? Has it been all day? Has it been multiple days? How long has it been raining, and so forth? So how long has there been meltwater being produced at the surface? And then another important factor with surface water production is it freezing at night? So when it freezes at night, that stops the water production. So that snowpacks, all the water in the surface freezes. And then the next day it kind of starts over, but it sort of hits a reset on it to a certain extent. And this phenomenon isn't very well understood, but it does seem to have a big impact. When it doesn't freeze at night, that water production happens around the clock, and things really kick into high gear. So when you have water production at the surface, the next question is, where is that water going? What's it doing? So hopefully this isn't too complicated here. But I got a little flow chart, pun intended, like where's the water flowing? So we have the meltwater at the very top. And then the question we want to ask ourselves is, what is that meltwater going into? Is it early in the season and going into a winter snowpack? Is it going into a transitional snowpack? So that's a snowpack that's maybe seeing a little bit of melt, but it's still sort of, you know, in the transition between a spring snowpack and a winter snowpack. Or is it going into a late spring or summer snowpack, a snowpack that's seeing a lot of water and multiple, you know, melt freeze cycles? If it goes into winter snowpack, that dry snow at the surface is like a sponge, and it really holds onto that water. And as a result, the water accumulates at the surface, and we get wet snow avalanches. So remember, the more water we have in the snowpack, you know, in this case, the surface layers, that results in a destabilizing and weakening of that surface snow, and we get those wet snow avalanches, wet loose avalanches, those sloughs that start as a point and then fan out as it goes downhill. If the meltwater goes into a transitional snowpack, so now it's going into a snowpack that's seen some melt already, maybe water has started to go down into the snowpack. So it may still accumulate at the surface, and we might still get those wet snow avalanches. But as you can see, it can still percolate down into the snowpack. And once it starts percolating down deeper into the snowpack, we start to become concerned about it wetting weak layers. So the water builds up in some of our buried weak layers and weakens those weak layers, and we may get wet slab avalanches. So I have the question marks here by the wet slab avalanches, because even though water wets, you know, may get down to weak layers, it doesn't necessarily mean we'll get wet slab avalanches. We can recognize when slab avalanches are more likely to occur. That doesn't mean that they will occur, if that makes sense. They're really a tricky phenomenon to predict. And then finally, you know, we all know that, you know, come like June, maybe, you know, even if you're out hiking in the mountains in July and you're seeing snow out there, no avalanches are happening at that point, even though it's, you know, it might be getting into the 70s in the mountains, never freezing at night. So there's a lot of melt going on, but the reason we're not getting any avalanches is that water is not accumulating in the snowpack. It's just draining right through. So once we've had enough melt going on in the snowpack, that water develops pathways through the snowpack, and it can sort of drain right through without accumulating anywhere in the snowpack and weakening it. So we get very few avalanches under that scenario. So we'll talk about a little bit, you know, so where our snowpack is in this spectrum between winter, transitional, and spring, late spring snowpack here in just a minute. So as we get water accumulation at the surface, as I just mentioned, that leads to the wet loose avalanches. So it's the surface layer of snow that's running on the surface, starting as a point and gathering steam downhill. And these tend to originate, if they're natural wet loose avalanches, they tend to originate from rocks on steep sunny slopes. And they can be big enough, you know, you definitely don't want to tangle with these, especially if, you know, if you're triggering these in steep exposed terrain, they can certainly be a hazard. They tend to be pretty predictable. Sometimes in the avalanche forecast, we'll talk about these gouging wet loose avalanches. And in this photo here, you might be able to barely make out a couple ski tracks going along the upper third of this photo. They're just traversing from the left side of the photo to the right. And as they were traversing across the slope, they triggered a wet loose avalanche. But in this case, water had accumulated. It was a shallow snowpack. Looks like the snowpack here was maybe about 2 feet deep. And since it was a shallow snowpack, it was likely very weak. And so water was accumulating in that entire snowpack. So once that wet loose got moving, it gouged down to the ground. And so this is still a wet loose avalanche. It's not a wet slab. We're still calling this a wet loose avalanche, but it's a little bit different animal than just those superficial wet loose avalanches. And it definitely involves a lot more snow. This is this avalanche, just to back up, occurred during a significant warm up in the first week of April, probably around April 6th or so. And then looking and it was in Gladiator Creek behind Galena Lodge. And this is the bottom of the run out. And you can see this is a lot of debris. If you got caught for this or went for a ride, you're going to get, maybe you don't get buried, but this thing's going to kind of, bend your joints in maybe some ways that you don't want them to go. So these can involve a lot of mass and be pretty dangerous. So these tend to happen in areas with kind of a weak, shallow snowpack during those prolonged warmings. And then once the water kind of moves beyond the surface layers and starts percolating down into the snowpack, then some other things start becoming a concern. Here, there's a lot going on in this pit diagram, but you don't really need to pay attention to anything other than you can see that at the surface that was wet. So there was meltwater occurring at the surface. And then that water was starting to percolate down through the snowpack. And we're starting to, once that water starts percolating down into the snowpack, we're starting to think about what kind of weak layers are down there that it could potentially wet and then weaken and potentially cause wet slab avalanches. So this water doesn't percolate down into the snowpack like in a uniform wetting front that usually occurs in these little preferential flow channels or fingers. And this photo on the right shows a flow channel that's kind of in the vertically oriented, that's frozen. So the water can, bypass various layers and then pool in weak layers as it moves down through the snowpack. This is an interesting photo from Banner Summit. And this was taken again in early April during that warm up we had in the first week of April. And water had percolated down through the snowpack and accumulated in this layer of surface hoar. Now the surface hoar layer had been buried in late January. So, I mean, at this point, this layer was over 2 months old. And I don't know if you can quite make out in the photo, but it just has that wet look to it. And that was pretty fascinating. So even though water had accumulated in that surface hoar layer, and as a result of accumulating there, it weakened that layer, we didn't see any wet slab avalanches on that. So it just goes to show that, the wet slab phenomenon, it's not as simple as just water getting down to the weak layer. There's other things going on there that are tough to understand and predict. During that same early April warm-up, this is on April 6th, up near the Coyote Yurt in the East Fork of Baker Creek, and a local guide sent in these photos. And this is pretty cool. Like, just like, midwinter when we have a bad persistent weak layer, they were getting some cracking on the slope on the left. And when they investigated that in a snow pit, they found that water had percolated down to those facets that existed near the ground that were buried back in mid-December. So, this layer was months and months old. And as water hit that, it weakened it and allowed the slope to collapse. And you can imagine that if this had occurred on a steeper slope, they certainly would have triggered a wet slab avalanche. And wet slabs on this photo on the left can sometimes be, smaller slides, big enough to bury or injure a person. But that one on the left was in Gladiator Creek, again, behind Galena Lodge. And it looks like a wet, loose avalanche kind of went downhill and then eventually kind of triggered a little bit of a wet slab. And then it flanked out a little bit further downslope. So that's not an uncommon phenomenon to see. But quite often wet slabs can be very large and destructive, especially when we're talking about weak layers that are buried a couple feet, 2, 3, or 4 feet deep, like it is in some portions of our forecast area. That photo on the right occurred in the Sawtooth, and that was actually back in March during our very first warm up of the season. And water likely percolated down to a layer in the middle of the snowpack and triggered this large avalanche that took out, multiple trees and actually a fair chunk of forest at the bottom of that path. And that was above Farley Lake kind of below Toxaway Lake, if anybody's done that popular hike in the summer. So wet slab avalanches, whether they're, small or very large, are going to be dangerous. They're going to involve a lot of wet, dense snow moving downhill.
Hey, Chris.
Go ahead, Scotty.
So we have a question here that you kind of answered it, but I want to make sure that you do. The question is, does percolating water create a layer of its own, or does it stop and lubricate an existing weak layer? So you kind of got at how it can do funny things to existing weak layers. Can it create a weak layer of its own?
Yeah, that's a good question. So water moving down through the snowpack tends to stop and accumulate at discontinuities in the snowpack. So hopefully discontinuity is not too intimidating a word, but basically at some interface between layers of snow with different properties. So maybe it's a difference, a storm interface, but generally it's an old weak layer, like an old facet layer, an old surface hoar layer, maybe an old crust. And in those situations, the discontinuity there causes a difference in the snowpack that tends to stop and block the water from percolating down, and it accumulates in that layer. And once it accumulates and that water content increases, it weakens that layer. So the water we often say it's lubricating a layer. I think that's probably not the correct word to use. When we add, again, we just increase the water content of a layer, it's going to weaken. It's, imagine going down to the gas station and getting a Slurpee. And, that basically is kind of frozen snow like you'd find in a spring snowpack. And it has really no strength whatsoever. So if you imagine that as a weak layer in the snowpack, that's what tends to happen. So hopefully that entered that. I think that was Seth that asked that. Thank you. So now, after a little bit of a review about wet snow, where do we stand kind of at this present point in time? So I've just really roughly kind of broken down where we're sitting with our kind of a late spring snowpack, transitional snowpack, and winter snowpack, like where those exist. So this is, really generalizing quite a bit over a large area, but by and large, I think it kind of holds. So areas that have a late spring snowpack, so these areas have seen a lot of meltwater, and in a lot of cases, they probably have some pretty good drainage channels, formed through the snowpack. So any meltwater production at the surface is going to be funneled down, through the snowpack and not accumulate. So we're unlikely to get large wet snow avalanches in these spots. Certainly possible, but these are the areas that are most likely kind of done their thing and on their way out. So here, this rows, if you're familiar with these roses, we have the lower elevations are the outer band working up to upper elevations in the middle. So all the lower elevations where there's still snow have seen quite a bit of water production, as well as the mid-elevation sunny slopes, those facing southwest, south, and southeast. Areas that are still in that transition. So these are areas that have seen some water, but they might still have some dry snow in the middle of the snowpack. They might have weak layers that haven't been wetted yet. So areas we're concerned with here are mid-elevation, shadier slopes. So west through north through east. Like if you go out right now, you'll likely find a surface crust on most of these. So there's been meltwater at the surface, but if you dig down into the snowpack, I bet you'll still find some dry snow once you're below the surface. And the same goes for the upper elevation sunny slopes, at least on some upper elevation sunny slopes. Some of those have already seen quite a bit of melt. Really, the only place you're going to see a full winter snowpack where it's dry even at the surface and then dry throughout the snowpack is the upper elevation north aspects. And in a lot of our forecast area, those upper elevation north aspects still have a pretty pronounced weak layer near the base of the snowpack, those facets that we formed back in early December. So we're kind of waiting and seeing what happens as those finally get water through them. So the transitional snowpack and the winter snowpack, these are the ones we really want to monitor as the spring progresses. And, the next warm-ups, the transitional snowpack areas might kind of do their thing. And then as we get into the late spring, sometimes, this could be clear in May, maybe even early June, depending on how the weather rolls. We could start seeing some activity on those upper elevation norths. But really kind of depends what shakes out with the weather. So speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about the outlook for the weather. Let's just talk about the short term, so kind of coming through the weekend.
Hey, Chris.
And I want to
Sorry to interrupt.
go ahead.
We had a couple folks who were raising their hands, and I tried chatting them to ask what their topic was, but I think if I'd love to get to them because I think they may have some live questions. And if they're about something that you already talked about, we'll see if you can hit it now. If it's about something you're gonna catch later, then feel free to say, you know what, save that question for a little later. Does that work?
No, that's awesome. I'm psyched that people are got something to ask.
Okay, so Ralph, if you're still out there, Ralph, I just gave you the green light. Go ahead and unmute and ask Chris your question if you're there. Are you there, Ralph? Okay, we'll try Corey. So Corey, I just unmuted you. Or I gave you the ability to unmute yourself. Are
Can
you
you hear me?
there?
Hello?
Yeah, you're there.
Sweet. So you kind of ended up covering it. So I was wondering about managing water percolation, kind of under the lens of spatial variation, and also managing like transition of seeing like on any given day when you might see winter transitional and late spring avalanches, or not avalanches, but snowpacks, and just kind of keeping an eye out for that. It helped when you pulled up the roses there. But just if you had some tips on environmental indicators and things to look for that you might be pushing up into that next mid elevation or upper elevation where you'd expect to see more of a winter snowpack, or here's a sign maybe water's percolating over here, but not the other side in this couloir. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll see if I can kind of give you some tips on that. I think with a little bit of experience, you can tell a lot just by looking at the surface of the snow. The more melt that's happened at the surface, the grains tend to get larger. So, you know, like on those kind of corn slopes, like if you're looking for corn skiing, it's called corn because those grains get, you know, kind of large and granular.
Right.
And so that's a sign that those slopes have seen quite a bit of melt. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, they've gotten into the late spring or summer snowpack, but that's going to be indicative that they've seen quite a bit of melt versus, you know, like as you wrap onto something that's a little bit shadier, that has seen less melt, you probably see kind of, it might be kind of wet at the surface, but it might be finer grained. Those slopes might be kind of, you know, tend to be kind of sticky and just mucky, you know, mashed potatoy snow versus slushy snow. So I think that's one way to tell. And then obviously slopes that haven't seen any melting at all are still going to have a dry snowpack or maybe just a really thin razor crust. Beyond the surface, it's really tough to tell how much water percolation has happened. You know, us as professionals even struggle to answer that question. You can certainly dig a few snow pits and, you know, kind of look and see, you can often see evidence that water's made it down into the snowpack. And it may not be like a uniform layer of water, but you might see some of those flow fingers, just showing evidence that it's kind of working its way down into the snowpack. But if you dig a pit in the snow and see that, and just, you know, kind of poke around quite a bit and see that, you know, the snowpack in the middle of the pack is completely dry, that's a sign that it really hasn't worked its way down at all. But a lot of it really comes down, and we'll get to this, but a lot of it really comes down to paying attention to weather factors. And, you know, we can't be quite as accurate as maybe we can in the winter. But we just try to learn and recognize the conditions that are going to lead to, you know, potentially promote the formation of bigger wet avalanches or wet slabs. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But hopefully that tells just some observational clues that you can watch out for. But a lot of it does tend, you know, it really follows these kind of elevation and aspect patterns.
Right on. Thank you.
Okay, I guess unless Ralph chimes in here, we'll keep rolling. All right. So yeah, let's just kind of
Hang on
transition.
one sec. Hang on one sec, Chris. I had removed his permission to talk. Let's see if,
Okay.
are you still there, Ralph? I'll give you another crack here if you're around. All right, we'll just keep going, Chris. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, so let's kind of transition from sort of where we're at now to where we're potentially going. And I think I want to preface this all by saying that I think if you've been paying attention to the weather, you've probably seen evidence of this, but springtime weather can be pretty unpredictable. We don't tend to get in these really clear patterns of high pressure, where it's just very obvious you're going to get, warm, sunny days and stable weather. Or, we're not in these cycles of big storms where we know it's going to snow a lot. We tend to be somewhere in between where, it might be kind of sunny, but it might be some clouds. We might get some snow, but we might get sun. So it can be a little tough to predict, and that definitely complicates the spring snowpack game. But this is the forecast looking out through the weekend, and looks like, today was kind of unsettled. I live up in Stanley, so I'm not sure what it was like in the Wood River Valley or elsewhere, but we had kind of a mix of sun and clouds, but mostly overcast weather. And looks like we're going to head into a little bit of a short-lived but stable, sunny and kind of high pressure period this weekend. So you can see that increasing sunshine Friday through Saturday and Sunday, and also increasing temperatures. But it does look like the temperatures at night are supposed to be pretty cold. So this weekend actually looks pretty good for getting out and enjoying some spring skiing and riding. Get good freezes at night and good sunshine for predictable thawing during the day as we head into the weekend. So that's looking pretty good. Ethan Davis, who's one of the forecasters at the Avalanche Center, and also one of our weather gurus. He's got a degree in meteorology, unlike the rest of us that are kind of self-taught weather hacks. He always cringes when I put up these NOAA weather outlooks, because he doesn't put much faith in these at all. So and he may be right on these, but I still like looking out ahead. So looking out at kind of 8 to 14 days. So this is taking us out through sort of mid to late April. And what this is showing here, the green is above average, a good chance for above average precip. The orange is a chance, kind of better chances for below average precip. And then the gray is sort of average precip. So you can see we're looking at kind of average to below average precip through the rest of the month, but not a super strong chance one way or the other. It does look like it may be a little bit drier than normal, which would certainly fit in the trend we've been in. And then looking at the temperatures, definitely a bit of a stronger signal for a good chance of above average temperatures heading into the later part of the month. So what does that mean? If we get into some prolonged, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but if we get into some prolonged warming with no freezing, that could lead to kind of worsening wet snow stability. Also could just lead to quicker melt. Seems like we're already ahead of schedule with losing our snowpack. So if anything, this might just tell you to get out and get it while you can. The snow might be dwindling. So as you get into the spring and we start transitioning into forecasting for your days out in the backcountry, let's talk a little bit about what to watch for when you're heading out here. And kind of following up on that last question, there's definitely some surface observations we can make about conditions. Looking at how much snow is melting at the surface. Are we sinking, down into deep, wet, mushy snow? Are we punching through the surface crust into bottomless wet snow? Those are all kind of basic observations we can make that indicate that we're maybe overstaying our welcome with the wet snow conditions, and we should be trying to get out of the mountains. But thinking about, we can know a lot about what's happening, which is broader scale weather conditions. So first with wet snow avalanche conditions, so that's primarily what we're dealing with into the spring. We're really watching for a prolonged major warm up. And I would say so far this year, we've had 3 of those. But as the spring wears on, these tend to become more intense. You know, the sun is higher up in the sky, the days are longer, the temperatures are warmer. So even though we've had, you know, maybe 3 major warming events, the next one could be much more significant than anything we've had so far. So we're looking for, you know, multiple days of super warm temperatures and a lot of sunshine. And that's exacerbated by events where we're not getting good freezes at night. And we'll talk a little bit more about nighttime freezing here in just a little bit. But you know, you can still have above freezing temperatures and get snowpack freezes at night if there's clear skies. So really what gets us is getting this warm, cloudy weather. You know, those are the kind of the storms that are, or the weather patterns that can be really nasty in the spring, just the warm, cloudy weather where it stays warm and doesn't freeze overnight. And then, you know, especially heading into late spring, you know, May is notorious for just getting these pretty nasty rain events that go all the way up into the mountains. So paying attention to those. To some extent, wet avalanches can be kind of a self-limiting phenomenon from a safety perspective. Usually when the wet avalanche conditions worsen, you know, the skiing and riding gets so bad that a lot of people just aren't even going out. So we do have that working in our favor there. But we don't want to discount, you know, dry snow avalanche problems at all this spring. You know, we can think so much about the wet snow that we'll get a dry, you know, a storm where dry snow falls, and we kind of forget that we can still get dry snow avalanche problems with these spring storms. So if we get snowfall and wind in the spring, we obviously want to be thinking about wind slabs. A really common phenomenon in the spring is we'll get a storm that drops some new snow, and then the sun comes out. As soon as that late spring sun hits that new snow, it just seems like it wants to avalanche almost immediately, usually in the form of loose snow avalanches. And then we also can't forget that we had a really bad persistent weak layer this year. Those facets near the ground, I mean, that was one of the worst weak layers that we've had in a long time. And it's easy to forget about it, you know, even though, you know, for the first 2/3 of the winter, we wanted to forget about it. Once that became less of a player, it is pretty quick how quickly we forget about that. So don't forget that there are some facets lurking in the snowpack, especially in some of those areas with weak, shallow snowpacks. You know, like the Boulder Mountains, that's kind of a common spring destination to get up and ski those high peaks, but they have a very, you know, weak, shallow snowpack. I'd imagine over in the Lost River Range is probably a similar type snowpack, and probably this, you know, the same in some of the upper elevation alpine terrain of the Smoky Mountains. This was from several weeks ago. We had a little bit of a snowfall, a fair bit of wind, and you know, people went out on a blue sky day and we're just finding wind slabs pretty commonly up in the high alpine. And so yeah, again, when we get, you know, new snow and wind, you don't want to turn off your dry snow avalanche radar, because you got to shift gears a little bit and back into that dry snow mode. And you know, these weren't big avalanches. A lot of these wind slabs were breaking 4 to 6 inches deep. But if you're going out and trying to bag a peak or a bigger objective and are traveling through consequential terrain, that's certainly big enough to kind of mess you up in the wrong spot. And then on April 6th, we did have one interesting kind of rogue persistent slab avalanche. And this was on Galena Peak. And this broke down into some weaker snow from earlier in the season. And this was the first avalanche we saw breaking on a persistent weak layer in quite some time. And this is still a head scratcher. You know, I still couldn't tell you why exactly this happened. I mean, we hadn't had really any significant loading in quite some time, just a few inches of snow and a little bit of wind. But just remember that, again, like I said before, there are these persistent weak layers lurking under the snowpack. And anytime we get some sort of loading event, thinking more along the lines of like a winter loading event, like new snow and wind loading, these weak layers may become a player. And again, most likely in those alpine areas where the snowpack is weaker and shallower and still dry. So that kind of brings us up to speed with what's kind of going on now, what to look forward to in the next week or two. And so daily forecast ended last weekend, and we're still, as I mentioned, still putting out general information about twice a week. But now that the forecasts have ended, what do you do now? You know, hopefully we like to think, maybe this is just us feeding our egos, but we like to think that we're putting out a valuable product that you guys are using all winter to help you enjoy your days in the backcountry. So now that it's ended and people are still getting out, what do you do now? And I got a poll here first. Just gonna throw up a question. So the question is, I find going into the backcountry after daily avalanche forecasts have ended, and there's a number of options. Go ahead and give you guys some time to choose those and see what you think. Okay, get your votes in there. Okay, looks like kind of the voting has tapered off there. But it looks like the vast majority of people find this an opportunity for learning and challenge, and I think that's awesome. Probably biased since you guys are all here listening tonight, trying to learn a little bit about what to do now that the forecasts have ended. But I think it is a really good opportunity to learn about a little bit more about forecasting for yourself. And you know, I don't want to poo-poo spring conditions by any means, but we do tend to have a more stable snowpack in the spring. There does tend to be a little bit, I wouldn't say more margin for error, but you know, it's a little different animal than dealing with the persistent slab avalanches that we're dealing with all for the bulk of the early and middle winter. So I think it is a good time to learn and come up with a forecast before you go out and see if your forecast ended up being correct. And if it wasn't, try to figure out why and do better next time. So for the second part of the presentation, let's talk about some techniques for doing your own avalanche forecast later in the season. So this is the time when I'm going to give away all my secrets, and you guys will all be applying for my job next year and probably better qualified. So at risk of losing my own job, I'm going to tell you guys all the secrets and how we do it. And I think one key thing for all of us at the Avalanche Center is we all have a routine that we go through in the morning, whether it's a checklist. I actually have a sheet that I have printed out, kind of a worksheet that I work through. But I think having a routine or a process is really important. And you know, if you've taken avalanche courses, there's usually some bigger process where avalanche forecasting is just a part of that, but a process for understanding and developing a plan for moving through the terrain of where you want to go, what terrain makes sense for the day, you know, who your partners are, whether you're all prepared. So I think probably a lot of you aren't any stranger to having a process before you go out. But so we're just focusing on the avalanche forecast part of that routine now. But I did want to share a little bit about kind of what my process is in the morning. And we're doing this on a much larger scale, obviously, for the whole forecast area. So you guys can narrow this down a little bit for the specific area you're going to on a given day. But the framework that I work in is super, super simple. I think of things as the past, the present, and the future. And this is how my little worksheet I work through in the morning is broken down. So let's start with the past. So in order to understand, you know, what's going on now and what's likely to happen on the day you're going out, you really need to have a fundamental understanding of what's already happened. And in this process and routine, we're going to focus on kind of what's happened during the last 24 hours. But it sort of assumes that you keep track of the conditions over the course of the winter. It's really the entire history of the winter that builds us up to the point we're in right now. So here's some key things about what's happened in the past. And this is what I look at every morning. I look at, first I go through observations. So I want to see what people saw the day before. And at the end of this, I should say that I'll show you some tools for doing a lot of this. Some of the tools on our website that can help you out with these. But I start every morning by looking through observations. And that gives me a pretty good idea of what happened the day before. So that gives me a starting point. So, and you know, we're fortunate that every year we're getting more and more observations. We're getting them from professionals like guides and ski areas and forecasters. But every year we're getting more and more from the general public. And I can't tell you how helpful that is. This year, I think we had over 300 observations over the course of the winter. So that's averaging like 2 to 3 a day, which is super, super helpful. So once I've read through those, I should have a pretty good idea what the day was like prior to the day I'm forecasting for. And then I look at weather stations. And this helps me kind of make sense of what happened the day before. And then based on what happened overnight, I can start to predict what things are going to be like in the present. So I bet a lot of you guys have already looked at weather stations, you know, just in the course of, you know, over the course of the winter. But, you know, we're looking at things like, you know, max and minimum temperatures. So as we talked about, temperatures are really important in the spring. How warm did it get? Did it get below freezing? And still paying attention to the wind, you know, even when we get in situations like we are in now, where there's really not any kind of loose snow available in the mountains to be blown around, still paying attention to the wind. The wind can help the snowpack freeze. It can prevent it from thawing potentially. So it still plays a role, and certainly plays a role if we get any new snow in a spring storm. So yeah, and then also paying attention to snowfall. So how much new snow did we get? And what is the water equivalent of that snow? So for those of you not familiar with SWE, that's snow water equivalent. That's essentially a measure of the weight of the snow, like how dense is it. So once I have that information, I can start to try to understand what's happening right now. And once I have a picture of what's happening right now, then I can start working towards the future of what I'm likely to encounter during the day. But we need to know what we're guessing is going on right now first. One of the most important questions and one of the hardest to answer in the spring is, did the snowpack freeze overnight? And I'll give you some tips here in a minute. That's a really hard question. And during that warm up we had in the first week of April, I really struggled with this one. You know, we had temperatures overnight that were in the mid 30s. I think the last night of that warm up only got down to about 40. And the last night of that warm up, I'm like, there's no way it froze. Like it seemed like we had a little bit of cloud cover and, you know, 40-degree temperatures in the mountains, and people went out and sure enough, it froze. So it's a really tough thing to predict, and it makes all the difference with wet snow stability. And just, you know, thinking about like another common thing, as we mentioned, are there wind slabs? Has there been new snow? Was there wind? And any other stability concerns. So just kind of, you know, not just focusing on the wet snow, but, you know, not getting surprised by other kind of dry snow problems we might encounter. So as I alluded to there, predicting the snowpack freeze is hard. I spent 2 seasons avalanche forecasting in Glacier National Park for the Going to the Sun road opening process. And we eventually installed this like $12,000, it was called a net radiometer. So it measured all the different types of radiation and energy going into the snowpack and going out of the snowpack. And even given that instrument, we still couldn't tell if the snowpack had frozen. So just kind of keep in mind, you're not gonna be able to nail this question all the time. But as we talked about, temps are important. So if the temperatures are below freezing, and we're below freezing for a lot of the night, that's good. That's kind of a gimme. But if the temperatures were above freezing, not all hope is lost. Cloud cover is more important than temperature. So when we have clear skies, and I don't want to bore you guys with the details of radiation balance at the surface of the snowpack, but think of cloud cover as like a blanket over the mountains. It locks in that warmth, and it prevents the snowpack from freezing quite often. Without that blanket, the snowpack loses a lot of energy to the clear sky, loses energy to space, and the snow surface can get colder than the air temperature even, and that allows it to freeze. So clear skies are really the most important factor for freezing. Unfortunately, when you're looking at this stuff and it's dark in the morning, it can be tough to know the answer there. My first tip is to go look outside. Go outside and see if you can see those stars shining bright. That's a good sign. You know, if you're planning on going somewhere quite a ways from your home, that might be less accurate, but that's a good first step. Webcams can be really useful, although they can be a little less useful in the dark, obviously. But even on some bright nights, you can see the stars in some of the webcams. Satellite imagery, starting to get a little less accurate here. But if you look at, you know, just like the water vapor imagery, that might tell you if there's some clouds overhead or if some clouds are headed your way. And also to some extent, our rate, when you're looking at relative humidity, which is one of the things that most of the weather stations measure, that can help somewhat. If the relative humidities are, you know, up in the, you know, 80 to 90 to 100% range, you can probably be pretty sure or certain there's clouds. Beyond that, it's really not telling you that much. Ultimately, you know, if in doubt, give it a go. Early on in my spring, you know, skiing career, I would, you know, think, oh, I didn't freeze, and I would just stay home and pull the plug on the day, only to hear from friends that, oh yeah, it was great corn skiing. So if in doubt, give it a go, but be ready to bail. You know, if you go out there and you're seeing evidence of a poor freeze, that's not really the time to push it, especially as you know, with the snowpack we have this year, where wet slabs are a possibility. You want to go out and find a really good freeze. So let's move on to the future portion of the forecasting routine. So looking ahead at what's going to happen during the day that I'm out. So this boils down to weather forecasts, and I'll show you some things there. And then answering the question, how is the forecast weather going to change what is happening right now? So things I'm looking at are like, what's the forecasted high temperature? How much sun is there going to be? Is there going to be wind? Those are all factors that are going to affect, you know, will it thaw? How much? How much is it going to melt at the surface? You know, if you have a weak freeze overnight followed by a really hot, sunny, warm day, the wet snow hazard is going to increase really quickly. You know, in contrast, like today, if you went out there, the thaw would have been delayed because the temperatures were cold, there was cloud cover, and you might have even found some pretty scratchy, hard, icy conditions out there up high. Is snowfall expected during the day? You know, maybe it snowed at night. Is it going to continue snowing? Is the wind going to keep blowing? So taking this weather forecast, applying it to what your knowledge is of the current conditions, the present conditions, and trying to extrapolate what's going to happen through the day. It's pretty easy just to look at the morning and look at what's happening right now back in that present section and kind of call it good. We really want to think about what's going to happen through the day that we're out. And that is especially important in the spring when things are changing so quickly. The stability can be drastically different in the morning compared to the afternoon. So now that we've worked through that past, present, and future framework, let's look at a few tools on our website that can help you answer some of those questions. And we're going to start with going to the Avalanche Center homepage here. And you can see there's no color rating on, there's no danger ratings, no colors on that map. So that gets us to that, okay, there's no forecast. What do we do? Hopefully some of you guys have used our new trip planner tool this winter. And if you haven't, I think this is a great time to get familiar with it. So the trip planner tool can give you all that information you need for sort of that past, the present, and the future, kind of all in a one-stop shop format. So in this example, let's say we want to go ski Galena Peak. So we can type that in there and click on this. Let me just go back here for a second. Make sure you have the trip planner toggle checked here. If you have this checked, it'll just go straight to the forecast. We want the trip planner, so make sure that toggle is checked. Okay, so this is what our trip planner looks like if you're not familiar with it. So as I mentioned, at least for this week and next week, we'll have some information out. It may not be, it might be a few days old, but I think you're still going to find it helpful. So don't bypass that. It's still going to be useful information. So be sure to read that information. And then as we scroll down, we start to get the information that can help us answer the past, present, and future questions. And this is actually pretty well set up. This first, either the map or the observation list view, this starts answering the questions of what happened in the past. So in the map here, we can see this is centered on Galena Peak, and we have some icons for weather stations. So we can hover over those and get current conditions. And if we click on these, like let's say I want to go to Titus Peak, that's a pretty high elevation site. That'll tell us what the wind is doing. So now we can go back and look at the 24 hours of weather. And you'd usually be looking at this in the morning, but you can see that the temperatures are pretty cold. They're well below freezing. So I would anticipate the wet snow avalanche hazard was kind of non-existent this morning. We can see this is the relative humidity column. When we can see the higher numbers, probably indicative of some cloud cover today. And looks like still a little bit of breezy conditions out there. And when we're getting winds from the north, those tend to be colder winds. So it might have been kind of a frozen, scratchy day out there on especially some of the upper elevation, colder places. So you can kind of work through the weather stations that are close to your area. And then you can also see there's actually a couple field reports still coming in. So this is one from yesterday and one from a couple days ago. So we're still getting some observations coming in. And at the end, I'll encourage you to do this again. But even though the forecasts have ended, your observations are really helpful to other people that are going out. So we can click on these and they would give us some information about what people were seeing. And if it's more helpful for you, you can also look at these in a list view. You can see and just click on these, and then you can also see the weather stations. And there haven't been any avalanches reported. If you're not seeing any information, you can expand the search parameters. You can go out more than a week, a month. You can choose your dates. You can expand the radius further out and get more information. And then we can see if there's any photos attached to those observations. Just out of curiosity, here is one. Somebody went up by that wet slab avalanche in the Sawtooth near Farley Lake that I showed earlier, and showed some of the destruction of that wet slab avalanche. So at this point, we would pause and say, okay, now we have a pretty good picture of what's happened in the past. Now, based on the weather conditions overnight, what's happening right now? Well, tomorrow I would, if this were tomorrow, I would expect that the snowpack is going to be pretty well frozen. The day is going to be starting out with very little in the way of wet snow problems. And my main question is going to be what's going to happen during the day. And that gets us into the future, which is reliant on weather forecasts. And this is usually where people like me to point out some real cool gee whiz weather forecasting tools and computer models and really neat stuff that's really cool to look at. But it's really not that helpful. I mean, if you're a total weather nerd, then you're going to figure out what those are on your own. Honestly, the Weather Service has gotten a lot better since, I've been doing this around here for over 15 years now. And the National Weather Service forecasts have gotten a lot better. And it actually is really my go-to tool these days. So the trip planner gives you a point forecast for that spot. So the elevation of this point forecast is about 9,500 feet. We know that Galena Peak is quite a bit higher, just around 11,000 feet. But we're at least sort of in the right ballpark. And we can see that tomorrow is going to be partly sunny. So that's gives us at least a chance for getting a little bit of a thaw, but the temperatures are still going to be cold and looks like a little bit of north wind. So tomorrow I'm still would be anticipating that the wet snow avalanche conditions aren't really going to get that dangerous. I'm actually probably be more concerned about the snowpack actually thawing in order to get some good ski conditions. So I'm just going to go back here, and I just want to show you a little bit more detail on a few components of this. So if you wanted to kind of see all of our weather stations, so the trip planner tool is nice to kind of help you wade through all the information that can be out there and give you stuff that's just relevant to the spot that you're going to. But if you really wanted to kind of nerd out and see what's going on all across the forecast area, we have this weather station map, and I bet a lot of you guys have used this. And you can get to this by going up to the weather and going to the weather station map. And you can click on any of these and it'll give you the 24-hour data that we looked at just a second ago. You can also see graphs. One thing that can be kind of helpful is looking at, like, let's go back to that tightest peak station. Let's look at the 7-day and look at the graphs. And this gives us kind of a nice view of what the temperatures have been doing over a little bit longer time frame. So maybe we're going out on the weekend and we haven't paid close attention to what's been happening during the week. This is a great kind of quick at a glance, see what's happened. So here's the 30-degree line. So we can see the temperatures have been below freezing for about 4 days. So, wet snow problems just have not really been on the table much the last few days. So yeah, more detail on the weather stations. You can also get to viewing all of the observations. We have this observation viewer. So I'm logged in here. So I'm seeing a few more observations than you'd see as the public. But this just gives you a whole list of all the observations that have come in. So you can get a bit more detail, but I think the trip planner is nice for just kind of honing in on the area that you're heading to. A little more detail on this point forecast. So this is kind of a nice at a glance information. But if you want a little bit deeper, try clicking on this hourly forecast. So this is, I kind of like to, just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to shut off some of this stuff because it can be a little bit overwhelming. So this gives us a plot of what the weather is going to do over the next, this is showing about 2 days here. So we can see how the temperature is going to trend during the day. So that's kind of nice. We can see the wind. We can see what the cloud cover is going to do. So that point forecast here, it says, okay, mostly cloudy. Tomorrow's partly sunny. Well, that's pretty vague. But if we look here, this blue is sky cover, this blue line. And if we're looking tomorrow during the daytime hours, which are this kind of block of white, we can see there's gonna be 70% cloud cover. And it's gonna be kind of decreasing through the day. So that combined with the colder temperatures, I'm definitely not feeling like if I was gonna go out tomorrow, I would need a super early start. Because it just seems like it's gonna be thawing pretty late, if at all. Looking forward to, this would be Friday, we can see the temperatures are getting a little warmer and the cloud cover is decreasing. So if I was gonna decide which of those days to go for, I'd probably choose Friday. It's more likely to get a nice predictable thaw of the snowpack surface. Okay, so even after my warning about totally nerding out on weather stuff, if you still want to really dive deep, you can go up to our weather menu and go to weather tools. And this has more stuff than you could probably learn to use an entire winter. But we have kind of the current weather observations that gives you sort of the past and current situation. And then a lot of this stuff is weather forecasting. So we have weather service point forecasts, which are basically the same thing the trip planner is spitting out. And then you can really, if you really want to, nerd out on some of the weather model stuff. This national blend of models, these products are pretty neat if you want to disappear down that rabbit hole. Okay, so let's just check through. I think, I think we covered all of those. So yeah, hopefully at this point, we've just given you a little bit of a kind of brief overview of creating your own avalanche forecast, thinking about it in the past, present, and future framework. Hopefully I left out a few trade secrets, so you're not actually stealing my job next winter, but hopefully it was enough so you can start feeling a little more comfortable doing your own forecasts in the late spring if you're still motivated to get out in the mountains, which I hope you are. So with that, I'm just going to give one final plug. I mentioned this earlier, but if you're heading out, please still submit your observations. I won't say it's more important than it is in the midwinter, because I just think it's always important. But hopefully now you can see that you are still helping other people that are going out into the backcountry after the forecast have ended. So you guys, thanks a ton for your attention. Thanks for showing up tonight. And hopefully we have some more questions.
Awesome. Thanks a ton, Chris. And again, thanks to the Friendly Ski Tech folks for sponsoring this edition of Digging Deeper. Yeah, we do have some questions. We have a couple queued up here. So Tom has one. Should Cornice collapse and Glide Avalanches be on our radar?
Yeah, great question, Tom. Thanks for bringing that up. Sometimes there's so much stuff going on in the spring, it's hard to cover it all. Excuse me. So Tom mentions Cornice Fall and Glide Avalanches. So let's touch on Cornices first. Cornices should definitely be on your radar, and sort of the same conditions that promote the wet snow avalanche danger increasing. So prolonged warm spells, especially on kind of still cold, dry, snowpacks or cold, dry cornices. Those tend to make those cornices sag, and then sometimes they fail. It does tend to be kind of random, but we can start to recognize when those conditions are, the warming conditions are starting to make that more likely. And we do tend to see evidence of cornices that have already failed. We do tend to get kind of those precursor sort of warning events. So if you go out there and you're seeing evidence of recent cornice fall and it's still warm out, definitely be cognizant of the cornice fall hazard. So, that can be a big thing. If you're say boot packing up a couloir that has the cornice at the top, you're have a pretty prolonged exposure to possible cornice fall. So if it's a really warm day, especially if you've seen evidence of the cornice of other cornices falling, you might want to rethink that. And that can definitely be more likely, especially in the spring, if we have a big spring dump of snowfall. It's combined with wind. So now we have some new fresh cornice that's formed, followed by warming conditions. That makes that even more likely. Glide avalanches are a pretty unique phenomenon, and I should probably even explain what those are first. So a glide avalanche is when the avalanche is failing because water is pooling on the ground. So basically you get a bunch of just wet, slushy, slurpy snow right at the snowpack ground interface, and the whole snowpack starts gliding downhill. So this can happen slowly at first. You might see a crack form in the snowpack, almost like a crevasse you might see on a glacier on the uphill side, and that slab of snow is starting to glide downhill, and that crack starts to open. And that may just keep opening, or it may actually fail catastrophically in a glide slab avalanche. There's really no great way to know that. It does tend to be pretty specific to the underlying kind of geomorphology of the terrain. So it tends to happen on flat bedrock. So like when I was in Glacier National Park, we dealt with these a lot because we had these inclined plains of really flat, smooth limestone, and we would get the glide cracks forming really the same spots year after year. They also tend to form on really kind of smooth, grassy slopes too. That's another common place to see those. We don't tend to encounter those a ton around here, but if you see a glide crack out there and it's a warm day, in Bruce Tremper's book, Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain, I think he had a pretty good take on that. And he said, glide avalanches don't tend to catch people, but there's no reason to be mucking around glide cracks or beneath them on hot sunny days. Hopefully that kind of sums that up.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I don't think we've seen any glide cracks yet this year. I don't know if Ben's on. He's been out more than we have the past few days and really every day. But typically it's big snow years. We see them in the Sawtooth on some of the big granite slabs, but I haven't seen one yet this year. Have you seen any glide cracks opening up yet?
I haven't really.
Okay.
Yeah, that's another factor that Scott brought up, is it does tend to take a fairly deep and sort of strong, warm snowpack. And this year certainly isn't what we have. Tend to be more common in maritime, Cascades, Sierra type places.
All right. So another question that and we could talk about this for days. And you answered most of it already, but I'm just going to read it anyhow to see if there's anything else you want to hit, anything that comes to mind. But Tom asked, what specific observations should we make and have on our radar when loose, wet slab, glide, or cornice avalanche problems are on our radar? So kind of go over what the observations are that you might make while you're out there, so folks can, when they're out on their own, can seek out more information when they're out there. Anything else come to mind that you didn't cover?
No, sorry. I think I was trying to read that question when you were reading it. I think I was reading the wrong question.
Yeah, no problem. So specific observations.
But I did find that one, so you don't need to repeat it. I'm sure
Okay.
everybody else heard it.
So any other like tricks of the trade that you have for things that you're doing?
I think it really boils down to, just to reiterate, I think we covered most of that, but to reiterate, really paying attention to the weather trends. So, prolonged warming, that's the big one. Prolonged warming, especially with no freezing at night or poor freezing at night, that's a really big one. And then, big springtime rain events in the mountains. I think those are the weather events to really be paying attention to that are going to make all those more likely. And then when you're out in the field, just really getting a sense of how wet the snowpack is, and just paying attention to how it feels under your feet. Are you sinking, are you sinking in only a few inches and the crust is really thick? If you get off your skis or your sled, can you punch through with your feet? Can you poke your ski pole, like the handle grip, through the crust? Or is it just so hard that you can't get your pole through? That's going to be pretty indicative of relatively strong conditions at that point in time. And then just monitoring that through the day. If you're starting to punch through the crust, especially if you're punching through to just bottomless stuff or punching through to the ground, that's a big red flag. If there's no crust whatsoever and it's just top to bottom snowpack mush, hopefully you're not on or beneath a steep slope at that point. But a lot of those, those warming related problems that were listed there, the loose, wet slab, glide, and the cornice, all are related to those intense warming events.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Boy, we have some good questions here. This one we could talk for hours. How long does the wet slab cycle usually last on a particular aspect before the transition to a summer snowpack with good drainage? And then how can you tell when it's over and we're into more of a summer snowpack?
I can't tell you that, because then you really would take my job.
Yeah, you would.
I can't tell you that because I don't know either. Those are $1 million questions that we don't know enough about the wet slab phenomenon to answer those. A part of it is we don't know, and a part of it is it depends. The more intense that warm up is, and like if you have a really intense warm up and it's prolonged and you actually see like a wet slab avalanche cycle where there's a number of wet slabs happening and then it cools off, there's a good chance you're out of the woods. And those aspects and elevations where those happened are over, but it's really no guarantee. Being able to detect a summer snowpack, or a late spring summer snowpack, that is somewhat observable. They just have a certain feel and look. Usually by that point, unfortunately, the skiing and riding is not very good. The snowpack surfaces can get really rough. Maybe not, sun cups, if you guys are familiar with those, but you can just see a lot of irregularities in the snowpack surface. The grains are really large, and really good indicator that the snowpack has kind of gone into that transition or through the transition and become a stronger late spring snowpack is you just have a really hot sunny day and the snowpack is still supportable, even late in the day. That's a really good clue that the snowpack is draining water and it's not accumulating it. If you're still sinking into deep wet mush, then that snowpack's still in the transition phase.
All right. I think, one thing that I'd add to that, it's both the complexity and a little bit of a general rule of thumb that one big thing to think about is just how much the sun angle changes as you move later and later into the spring. And I've spent, like Chris, most of my career in similar latitude, kind of Southwest Montana and here, my avalanche career, which is going to be dramatically different from Southern Colorado or Juneau, as far as how things change. And the big wet slab cycles that I've seen generally are late April through mid-May, when you have a nice cool spring and then you get an abrupt warm up when the sun angle is really high. So like if you get that abrupt warm up like we did in March, you're only going to get a little narrow wedge of the compass, the southern third of the compass, that you're going to have the potential to get wet slab avalanches, just because the sun plays such a big role in, like Chris said, that in creating that water factory up near the surface and melting the snow. The warm temps aren't going to do it on their own. The sun plays a big role. So we're just kind of barely getting into the sweet spot. And like if you're going to design the perfect wet slab avalanche scenario, we'd stay cold and have it snow a lot for like 2 more weeks and then be 75 degrees in town, not 65. So the other thing that I'd say is the ratio of people wearing shorts and t-shirts and flip-flops that don't look like freaks. I mean, I dress like that a lot, but I kind of stand out right now. And when that's the norm more than the exception, for the first time of the year, that's a good time to not be out in the mountains. That's kind of my general ballpark rule of thumb, basically. But yeah, I'd really pay attention to the west, northwest, and east, northeast aspects that over the next week and a half, 2 weeks, month, because they really haven't had water getting very deep in the snowpack once you get north of due west or due east. So those aspects are going to be really suspect in my mind. And like Chris said, it's so inexact and so hard to predict. You need just the right amount of water getting down at just the right rate to the weakler that we know that we have on those aspects. So just kind of a creepy setup. Don't forget about how ugly it was in January, because it may become like that in late April and May again. You got anything to add on that, Chris?
No, I liked your garage science edition there of the proportion of shorts and flip-flops.
It's real though. I mean, it's the biggest indicator that something's different. So the next question then, how long after a snowfall should we be worried about dry snow problems in the spring, and what affects their time to heal? So it affects how long does it take? And I assume temps and snowfall wind are big considerations for healing, but how do you kind of compare that to winter, say?
Yeah, so the good news with I think with dry snowstorms in the spring is that if they fall in the absence of wind, that new snow tends to bond pretty well to the old surfaces. It just has to do with the conditions being warm. The bonding happens more quickly when it's warm. So there's certainly circumstances where that's not the case, but by and large, when we get just new snow without wind, it tends to bond pretty well. But if we get wind with that, then all bets are off, and you got to start thinking about wind slabs. But they do heal relatively quickly. In the absence of persistent weak layers, that's going to be on the order of a day or two, maybe 3 days, maybe at the most. Past the snowfall and wind event. The downside is that as soon as the sun comes out, then all heck can break loose in the mountains after a new snowfall. Especially as Scott's talking about, as that sun angle increases into the late spring, And as soon as that sun hits the snow, it tends to start sloughing almost immediately. So if you get a really cold snowfall and then followed by just a hot spring sunny day, the mountains are going to go through what we often call a shed cycle, where on the steep slopes they just shed all the new snow. So a little bit of a good news, bad news scenario. It's good if you're out and you catch it, and in that case, a little bit of cloud cover and cold temperatures are good for enjoying some late spring powder. But as soon as the sun comes, there's really not much. It's pretty unlikely to get a nice sunny powder day in the spring. It just doesn't seem to work that way.
All right. And then we have kind of a condition specific in your neck of the woods question about the Redfish Trailhead. So is the Redfish Trailhead open, and how's the approach up to Williams Peak these days?
The Redfish Road is still closed. I believe that stays closed until May 1st, I believe, is when they open that gate. It has been plowed for work at the Redfish Lodge. So I think you could bike it, which is kind of nice.
They did plow it already.
They did.
So yeah, I think you're allowed to ride a bike on it, then you just can't drive.
Pretty sure I was there when they had the dozer and a good portion of the road was plowed and looked like that was what they were doing. But it's still gated until May 1st, is my understanding. I imagine a lot of the south facing low elevation stuff is going to be melted out, but I think shadier stuff in the low elevations around Stanley has still got snow, but it's going fast. Expect to find patchy conditions down low at best.
All right. We gotta have someone out there. We've only had 4 people drop off, so 5 now. A lot of people are hanging tough though. Someone has to have a live question for Chris. It's your last crack at him all year. You gotta wait till next fall if you don't get it in now. Any other questions? Oh, there we go. We got a hand raised. Okay, John, go ahead and ask your question. Should just need to unmute yourself and you'll be able to talk. If you're out there, John, you should see a microphone button where you can just click that on the bottom left of your screen, a mute or unmute, or a microphone icon that you can unmute. Well, maybe he accidentally raised his hand. I don't know. Anyone else out there? Anyone have any questions for Chris? We'll hang out for a minute and see if he's having a technological glitch.
Well, in the meantime, Scott, I got a question for you.
Uh-oh.
You got any tips for predicting whether the snowpack froze overnight?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, I'll just reiterate what you said before about cloud cover is a huge thing. I mean, it can be 38 degrees and clear skies and you're going to get a freeze just from the long wave radiation loss. And again, I don't want to bore people because it's a really complex topic that I'm not the one to be speaking about and trying to teach people. But I think that if you have clear skies, you're generally going to get some freeze. And whether you're sledding or skiing, all it'll dictate is how early you need to be out there and how long that freeze will last. But with clear skies, things are going to freeze at least a little bit. The ugly situation is when you have a prolonged warm spell where it's, maybe it's above or below freezing at night, but it's still clear, and then it's getting hot during the day. And then all of a sudden it clouds up in the afternoon or the evening. So after it's been, 50s in the mountains, and then it only gets down to 38 or 40, but it's cloudy, you're still going to have water slowly melting, but mainly just not freezing as it moves down into the snowpack. And I've seen a couple really weird, creepy wet slab avalanches in my career that release naturally in the early morning hours, just as that water that's going down from the day before, evening before, and then you don't have the cold temperatures to halt that, or the radiation loss at night, because you get clouds and you get these natural avalanches at 7 or 8 in the morning. And it's pretty tough to plan for that, or forecast for it, or plan your ski day around it. So yeah, if you have hot weather the day before and then it's cloudy at night, and especially if it's been kind of a building type scenario, it's not the first day that happens, all bets are off. That's a good time that I don't really want to have any part of trying to go skiing or snowmobiling where water's moving down into the snowpack. Does that kind of answer it, Chris?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so we'll try again here. John, are you out there now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Awesome.
Fantastic. I had some privacy issues apparently on my phone.
No problem.
Hey, I'm in the Boise area, and kind of first opportunity I've had in a long time to kind of ski this time of year. And I was the one that also asked the question about the Redfish Trailhead. So I've skied that Williams Peak area. I've skied at the Williams Peak yurt last 2 winters, and both times up there, just early in the year, really January, February, and no opportunity with avalanche danger to really ski anything super intriguing. So really more a logistical question for me, just approach wise, like, being in Boise, don't know what the snowpack is in that area now. Looks like, I don't know, Banner Summit, the last time I checked, was right around 40 inches. Just like if there's an easier approach into that area, or is like from the ranger station kind of the main approach, or is that Williams Peak Trailhead, or this, I guess the Sawtooth or Redfish Trailhead a better approach, or how do you get in that area, and what could I expect if I'm coming up a week from this Saturday?
Hey, John. Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks for tuning in from Boise. That did actually bring to mind one thing I forgot to mention. So if you come back to our weather station map, and these don't show up in the trip planner, but these little icons here indicate webcams, and these are pretty useful. And
Okay.
to your question, there's one here at Redfish Lake, and this one, I guess, it's shut off for the day. It doesn't show during the nighttime hours, but and unfortunately, there's no way to kind of go back through them. But this looks right at Redfish Lake, so it gives you some idea of how much snow is at that elevation that you're starting at. So I'd check that tomorrow during the day. There's also this one here in Stanley, so you can still see there's some snow in the valley bottom there. Smiley Creek is this is sorry, moving beyond your question for a second, John, but Smiley Creek's pretty helpful. So yeah, check out those webcams too. More specifically to your question, John, the fastest approach in there right now is from the Stanley Ranger Station, probably the same way you went up to the yurt before. Once that Redfish Road opens on May 1st, then going from the Redfish kind of fishhook trailhead cuts off about a mile. Once that opens May 1st, but we're a couple of weeks out from that. So for the near future, just going from the Ranger Station's the fastest.
But you could bike into that trailhead. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, it'd probably be a point of diminishing returns, because you'd bike there and then you probably have pretty patchy snow because that climbs a south-facing slope. Whereas the trail into the main Williams Peak Hut Trail stays kind of shaded in the trees and is probably more consistent snow cover.
How would you rate those west-facing aspects right now, like that skier summit area, and maybe even that profile basin a little bit?
Right now there's just with those cold temperatures that we showed, everything's pretty locked up and frozen. It's generally, at night, and during the day it might be thawing a little bit, but doesn't seem to be thawing enough to create much in the way of wet snow problems, and really no dry snow problems on the high north. So right now we're not doing danger ratings, but it's probably about the same as it was last weekend, which was low. Coming into this weekend as it warms up, things, wet snow stuff will be on our radar again. And then next week looks like a little bit of a kind of a crapshoot, unsettled weather. So hard to predict what's going to happen next week.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the question, John.
Thanks, John. And bring your crampons if you go up there if it's not sunny.
Got him.
So another question, Chris, and boy, this is a good one too. Could spend hours. Any tips for timing corn on various aspects?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't really cover the aspect or the kind of the aspect dependence of timing corn. So, corn skiing is best when, you've had a good freeze overnight and the snowpack starts out, in a nice hard rock, rock hard state, frozen. And then as the sun warms it, those kind of snow grains of the surface thaw and you have a nice kind of soft, supportable, carvable surface on top of the base, the base of the frozen crust. So just in case some people I think everybody probably knows what corn is, but in case you didn't. And timing the melt can be a little tricky. So first, just think of the overall timing. So that has to do with, how fast is it going to warm up and how sunny is it going to be? If it's going to be a sunny, hot day right off the bat, and the freeze has maybe not been that great, then the timing overall on all aspects is going to be faster. If there's maybe a little cloud cover in the forecast and colder temperatures, then the thaw might happen a little slower. And it's hard to put a number on that. Yeah, really no magic there. It's just kind of taking a guess. It's always better to be early than late, that's for sure. So bring a warm coat and a book on your iPhone to listen to at the top while everything's thawing, or take in the view, whichever your choice is. And then getting into aspect, southeasterly aspects are going to get the first sun hit. So as the sun rises, those are going to get the sun first. So those are the aspects that are going to turn to corn first. And then the sun's going to wrap onto due south and then eventually wrap onto southwest and west in the afternoon. So that's kind of the order of the timing as it depends on aspect. And, the difference between when east or southeast is corn and when a west to southwest is corn, that's hard to predict, but that can be on the order of maybe a couple hours potentially. It could be as little as an hour. It could be as much as maybe 2 to 3 hours. But yeah, there's kind of an art to timing that, and it's definitely not an exact science, and you can't really expect to nail it all the time. But if we're in a stable melt free cycle, it's pretty helpful to talk to people that have been out and say, hey, what time did the corn go off, on this aspect. So.
Yeah, that's a great point, to make sure you check out the observations, and you may get some tips in there from if people are nice enough to write down what time they were skiing or riding different aspects and how it was. That's always a huge clue, is what did it do yesterday, and start there as your baseline. And then I think I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was just saying, just a total like shot in the dark crapshoot answer is, on a day with a good freeze and this time of year, like you could kind of expect east to southeast to be pretty good at maybe 10 in the morning might be a good shot in the dark. And, west to southwest might be like noon, maybe 1. So I don't know, throwing that out there.
Yeah, no, that's great. The kind of, you can see that there's, hours as you rotate around the compass, which kind of reinforces one of my mantras in life, that indecision is a key to flexibility. So if you can plan your trip so you have the choice of multiple aspects and you're not set on skiing or riding one exact line, and you do have choices, that you may not need to sit up there and read a book or play tiddlywinks for 2 hours. You may have other options. You can do a couple laps while you're waiting. Now let's see, I think, do we have any other questions? Yeah, no, I think that might be it. Oh, here we got one. We have a hand raised. Kathleen, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. Are you there, Kathleen? Should be able to find like a mute button or a microphone icon down on the lower left of the screen, I think. Oh, might have been an accidental.
Maybe more of those privacy issues. I think if people are trying to use their microphone the first time, they might have to go through a little bit of a process.
It might have been, yeah. We'll see if she pops back up again. While we're waiting to see if Kathleen has, if that's a question, she can get back on. I have one question for you, Chris. I'm curious on your opinion on weather models. So do you trust them more in the winter or in the spring? Weather forecasts and models.
I trust them more in the winter. Yeah, as I kind of alluded to, in the winter you tend to have these broader scale patterns, and you have a very well defined high pressure ridge or low pressure trough, and it may be hard to predict exactly how much snowfall you're going to get, but it can be more predictable. Hey, we're in a stormy period versus we're in a more of a high pressure stable period. When you get into this unsettled spring weather, really you could have anything. Yesterday was supposed to be pretty cloudy and ended up being almost mostly sunny a lot of the day. You might get these spring squalls where maybe they're forecasting for you might see a few flurries and you might get 4 or 6 inches of snow in a small localized spot. I think we've all been in those just kind of crazy snow squalls where it's just dumping like 2 inches an hour for 2 hours, and then all of a sudden you got 4 inches of snow, and you talk to somebody that was 10 miles away and they didn't get anything and they're sunburned. So I think spring definitely opens up the doors to more variable and unpredictable weather.
All right. Well, if we have any other questions, it's kind of last call here. It's been a great freewheeling question and answer session. I like it. Anyone else? Last call there. Last call for the 2021 season. Digging deeper questions. All right. Well, with that, I think we're gonna call it a wrap. So, Chris, thanks so much for putting this together and answering all these questions for everyone. It's been awesome. Do you have any parting words of advice or wisdom as people head out there?
Well, yeah, I mean, first, thanks to all you guys for tuning in tonight and for tuning in all season. We really appreciate your support. We couldn't do this without your support, without your help through observations. And I hope you've been finding what we're doing valuable, and hopefully it's been helping you get out and enjoy the backcountry. So keep doing that this spring, and enjoy the snow till it's gone, and then move on to whatever's next for you this summer. But we'll see you next winter.
Sounds good. Well, with that, we're going to sign off. So if anyone has any further questions, you can always email us at info@sawtoothavalanche.com. Probably everyone here who's still on is fairly much a diehard and knows how to get in touch with us, but please do submit your observations. As you can see, just the timing of when things are softening and when things aren't. If you submit an ob and make it publicly viewable, you're going to help your friends out and other fellow riding and sliding enthusiasts on how to time it and hit it when it's just right. And have fun and pay attention to those changing conditions out there, because we're potentially not done yet with our weirdness given the weak layers in the bottom of the snowpack. So when it gets really warm, pay attention. And thanks a ton for all your support, everyone who's been watching, listening, submitting obs, donating to the friends. The Avalanche Center wouldn't be what it is without you guys and girls. So thank you very much. Cheers.
Have a good night, everyone.